What leads to unemployment, in particular what leads to frictional unemployment. So a lot of my early work was trying to measure, in some sense, the first level of the frictions at the employer side. Why do jobs blow up? What does it mean for workers? What determines whether you can easily find another job when you lose one? And so these very much involve things that are happening on the ground for individual workers and businesses, but then they also interact to determine the overall unemployment rate and fluctuations in the unemployment rate over time. And I happened to go to graduate school at a time when I think there was a tremendous wave of innovation on the theoretical side in terms of understanding frictional unemployment by guys like Dale Mortensen and Peter Diamond and Chris Pissarides, and that had a big effect on me. And early in my career, I started thinking about, okay, but how would I go about getting a better handle on these things empirically? And that led to my early work with Halterwanger, trying to measure the pace at which jobs blow up at the employer level. By blow up, I mean they disappear, the worker loses his job, is thrown into the unemployment pool. And that's very much, as you described, kind of a micro approach to macro questions.
Also, it differs a little bit. For example, I've also done a lot of work on unemployment, but I have approached it mostly as a labor economist with a focus on the individuals and how the individuals deal with unemployment and how fast they find jobs and how likely they are to lose jobs. I think a large part of what separates your research from really most of the research I know of in unemployment is a real micro study of the employer side of that equation. That is, the drivers on the employment side, and obviously the labor market, like all markets, has buyers and sellers. I mean, in this case, the sellers are the workers selling their services to the employers who are the buyers. And what's sort of funny about labor economics, it's largely a study of only the workers. And that very much really talks about employers. And I think that's really the value your work with Halterwanger, but also the value of much of the more recent work you've done has brought a much richer employer perspective about employers to studying these labor market issues and what's driving the decision making of employers. And I would like to talk to you about some of that today, but to me, I see that as like the real biggest innovation in your work. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, that seems fair. To a considerable extent, economists and probably other social scientists go where the data are. And I think the data, the kind of really rich data on the micro side, became more readily available for workers and households than it did for employers. And I think that accounts for what you said earlier, that there was already 30 years ago a very rich body of research looking at kind of the micro approach to big picture labor market questions from the worker and household side, and that was much less developed from the employer side.
So then you and Halterwanger got data on actual firm histories over time and whether they were growing and whether they were going out of business or they were starting up. And
right.
A lot of work I remember that you did, and this is going back many years ago, was about business formation and the importance of new businesses and the firm death process. And you have firms being born, firms dying, and you had firms growing and shrinking, and that was the employer side of driving unemployment. And much of what your early work did was to document that and how important each of those things are. Let's talk a little bit about why that's relevant in today's world.
Let me start with a couple background observations. I think it's well known among economists and people more generally, I think, have some sense that labor market outcomes have not been what we'd like, especially for people kind of the lower rungs of the earnings distribution, less education, less obvious credentials. You can see this most dramatically in the decline, which has been going on for decades now, in the employment rates of less educated men, especially younger, less educated men.
So what would you say, like if somebody said, well, what do you mean? Now, what's the decline?
10, 12, 15 percentage point decline in the share of, say, high school educated men who are not working, not going to school.
You mean the decline in the fraction that are, an increase in the fraction that are not working or in school?
Yeah, I don't remember what the exact numbers are, but you can see this basically going back at least to the late 1970s. And what's interesting is, in the last 15 years, you start to see the same patterns among women. So we think of ourselves and our society as one that's become increasingly welcome to women in the labor force, since, basically the World War II. And in many senses, that's true. But for whatever reason, for less educated men, and again, more recently for less educated women, we see those trends reversing. That's pretty worrisome, and to me anyway. And you asked me what I see some of the big questions, and it's worrisome both from the perspective of economic performance, but also from the perspective of social cohesion. People feeling like they have a stake in society, and for many people, especially for men, and increasingly for women, a big part of having a stake in society is being gainfully employed.
So I talked to Jim Heckman a while back, and we talked about people being engaged with the economy or engaged in society. And I think that's kind of the same theme you're talking about here, which is, when people talk about economic inequality, they talk about income inequality, but you'd say it goes beyond that. You got to think about engagement. That it's important how much you make, but it's also probably at least as important whether you're engaged in the economy. And other issues out there today, right? So one issue that we want to talk about is, well, what's going on with low-skilled men, low-skilled women, probably more so men than women, but increasingly women all as well, I guess is the way to think about it. Young workers in particular, particularly the young, less skilled workers again. So that's one aspect, what's going on with particular segments. What about just the economy as a whole? Just we hear about slow growth. We've now reached this slow growth situation where not just for those groups, but the economy as a whole doesn't seem to be, at least according to some people's measures, performing as well as it could or it has been. Or
it's pretty hard to escape the conclusion that growth's been slow. And not just since the financial crisis in 08-09. So for whatever reason, the recovery from the last recession, the financial crisis and the recession, has been quite anemic. You see that most strikingly in terms of the employment growth numbers we talked about earlier, employment rates, but just in terms of GDP growth and things like that, which in some sense is harder to measure. But even on the basic things like what fraction of the working age population is engaged, as we talked about earlier, it's very low. What gets less attention is the economy was already underperforming in many respects relative to kind of the standards in the previous decades, at least since 2000. And again, it's tied into these deteriorations in employment trends that we talked about earlier. They seem to have worsened about around 2000. So it's not just that we've had a weak recovery from the recession, but we've had at least 15 years of pretty subpar performance, both in terms of labor market outcomes, wage growth, employment rates, but also slow productivity growth, slow growth overall. So 15 years is a long time to have a slowdown. It makes you think there's something that underlies that slowdown and makes you worried about it.